So yeah, I'm Kate and I'm a research associate in the Neuroscience of Speech and Action Lab in the psychology department. And I'm going to talk a little bit about hearing loss and the brain. And some of the themes that I'll talk about, we touched on in an article that we published a couple of years ago now. But if you're interested in the themes I talk about and you want to read more about it, you can follow this reference on the screen here to read a bit more about these topics. So first, let's talk about how we hear and how hearing works. So in order for our brain to understand sounds in the environment, the ear first needs to convert sounds that are vibrations in our environment into electrical messages that our brains can read and understand. So the ear has to put in a bit of work first. So the first thing it does is it gathers sounds from the environment and funnels it down into the ear canal. And the outer part of our ear, the bit that you see when you look at a person, is shaped in a really specific way so that it can do this. So that part of the ear gathers the sounds and funnels them down into the ear canal. When the vibrations travel down the ear canal, they reach the eardrum and it causes the eardrum to vibrate. And this vibration of the eardrum starts off a chain reaction within the ear that leads to these three tiny bones within the inner ear to vibrate as well. And they're the smallest bones in our body and they amplify the vibrations and they transmit those vibrations to the cochlear. The cochlear is this purple kind of snail looking coiled structure here, and we'll go into detail about the cochlear on the next slide. So the cochlear is coiled up and it's filled with fluid. And all along the length of the coil, tiny hair cells line the whole length of it. And when those vibrations that are transmitted by those bones hit the cochlear, it causes the liquid inside of it to move. When that liquid moves, these hair cells move too. And when those hair cells move, they create an electrical signal and they send that signal to the auditory nerve, which takes the signal to the brain, to the hearing part of the brain, the auditory cortex. And what's really cool about the cochlear is that it's arranged by sound frequency. And what that means is that different hair cells that I mentioned, those hair cells that line the length of it, different ones respond to different sound frequencies. And at the start of the cochlear, that's where high frequency sounds are picked up. High frequency sounds are things like birds tweeting or a baby crying. And then as you move down the length of the coil, the frequency that those hair cells respond to gets lower and lower and lower until at the center where it responds to the lowest frequency sounds. Low frequency sounds would be things like thunder. That's a low frequency sound. And I have a couple of sound examples to show you what a high frequency sound sounds like and what a low frequency sound sounds like. So I'm going to play those, but just to warn you that it might sound a bit loud if you're wearing headphones. So this here, high frequency, and this one, low frequency. So we can see the difference there. But what happens as we get older is that those hair cells that line the cochlear, they experience atrophy, so they get damaged over time. And that damage typically starts at the start of the cochlear, the part that responds to those high frequency sounds. So that's why, as you get older, I don't know if you've ever compared your hearing to your grandparents or something like that, and you've tried to listen to different frequencies of sounds, and you'll notice that older people can't hear high frequencies as well as younger people can. And that's because they experience that atrophy or degeneration of those hair cells over time. On the screen here, we have a graph that represents this kind of age-related hearing loss that occurs as we get older. And I'll just talk you through the graph quickly. So along the x-axis, that's the horizontal axis, we have sound frequency. So the frequency of the sound that somebody hears, ranging from low frequency, 250 hertz, to high frequency, 8,000 hertz. And along the y-axis, so the vertical axis, along the side there, we have the loudness of the sound ranging from quiet sounds, -5 decibels, to very loud sounds, 45 decibels. And on this graph, we have plotted three kind of imaginary people, and we've plotted their hearing ability. So if we look first at the pink line, this is a hypothetical person aged 20, and as you can see, the line is flat, and that means that they can hear all these frequencies without the volume needing to be very loud. They can hear it all easily. And then if we look to the second line, the kind of light pink, purpley, probably light purple line represents a hypothetical person aged 50. And we can see that the line kind of sort of veers off towards those higher frequencies. And that means that those frequency sounds need to be presented at a louder level in order for that person to hear them. And that's because those hair cells are less effective in converting the sounds to electrical messages. So that it needs to be louder in order for them to be perceived. And then we have our final person, a person age 70. We can see that the line is even steeper, veering off. Those high frequency sounds need to be even louder. And we can see that it started to affect some of the lower frequency sounds as well. So some of those ones also need to be louder in order for them to be heard. So what does it mean for communication when somebody has hearing loss? So let's do a thought experiment. Imagine ourselves at a cafe and we're talking to somebody about how excited we are for Science Week. And when you have hearing loss, or a person has hearing loss, like I said, the ear is less effective in converting those sounds into electrical messages that the brain can read. And we can think of that as like the brain gets a message with missing pieces. We can think of it as like missing letters in the sentence. So we get an incomplete sentence. And then you're in the busy cafe and loads of people come in and they're all talking. And then the barista starts playing cafe music, and all of these sounds mask that speech that you're trying to listen to. They mask what your friend is saying, and it makes hearing really difficult. So we're not actually left with a really clean signal that our ears pick up. We're left with something that's quite messy, that our brains need to work hard to decipher the message in amongst all of the noise. So just to recap, when the auditory system is damaged because of hearing loss, or when you have environmental noises masking the signal that's then sent to the brain is diminished. And we want to know what that means for how our brains process it. What does that mean for brain function? Luckily, the brain is a really good problem solver. And in order to understand how the brain works, we need to understand that not just single brain areas work separately. Lots of brain areas and brain networks work together in order for us to understand our environments and perceive the world around us. In the case of hearing, first we have the auditory area where the auditory message is sent to first. And this kind of decodes the sound that the ears pick up, and it identifies characteristics in the sound, loudness, frequency, pitch, direction, and things like that. What's cool, fun fact, is that even when you're asleep, this brain area responds to sounds in your environment, but the other brain areas don't, because we're not consciously responding to the sounds. Whereas when you're awake, there are lots of different brain areas that are also active to help us understand speech and sounds. For example, in the case of speech, so if we think back to our cafe example, attentional brain networks can help us to focus in on the speaker that we're trying to attend to, and use our cognitive processes to inhibit the background noises and help us to attune to that one person that we're trying to listen to. And then we have movement areas or visual areas that could help us to lip read. So we look at the person's lips to help us decipher what they're saying, and we look at the movement of how their lips are moving to tell us what word they're saying. So from this, we can see that the brain works in a way where all these brain areas kind of come together to help us deal with a noisy environment, to help us decode a messy signal, and to understand what somebody is saying. Now, there's evidence. We know that the age-related hearing loss affects those hair cells in the ear that I spoke about, and we know that means that those reduced signals are sent to the brain. And there's evidence for this actually affecting how the brain works. So there's some researchers that found that the hearing area of the brain, the auditory cortex, shows atrophy in people with age-related hearing loss. They found that there was actually less volume there in their brains compared to people who did not have age-related hearing loss. But it's important for us to realize that as we get older, our brains experience atrophy anyway. So it's important for us to decide whether hearing loss kind of increases that level of atrophy. And what does that mean for other brain areas that we also are known to be involved with speech perception, like those attentional networks or the movement area that I spoke about just before. So researchers have looked into this too, and they have found that the attentional networks are actually more active in older people with hearing loss. So they're increased activation when they're trying to listen to speech. And the researcher who looked at this suggested that this happens to compensate for reduced auditory processing, so reduced processing in the hearing area of the brain. So other brain areas need to upregulate to help out and help to understand the message. Other researchers found a similar thing. So they found increased activation in movement areas in older people compared to younger people when they were trying to listen to speech. And interestingly, they found that these increases in brain activity in the movement area were actually related to better performance on the speech task. So when there was more activation, the participants were doing better on the task. So there's evidence that it's got a functional facilitatory effect as well. So what I'm trying to tell you with this evidence is that there may be brain compensation, upregulation, and changes happening across the brain, not just limited to the hearing parts of the brain, but across a number of domains after somebody has age-related hearing loss. And if the brain is functioning in a different way when somebody has hearing loss or after they've had hearing loss, what does this mean for how the brain completes other processes or other functions? So a recent report reported that hearing loss is potentially the biggest modifiable risk factor for dementia. But the mechanisms or the reason for the relationship between midlife hearing loss and cognitive decline or dementia isn't clear. And researchers suggest different hypotheses for why this relationship might exist. One of these hypotheses is called the cognitive load hypothesis. And that suggests that hearing loss leads to people having to invest more cognitive resources, more mental effort in order for them to hear speech. And what that means is that the brain has to use more resources. And these researchers suggest that the resources in the brain are limited. So if you have to use more for listening or understanding speech, there are fewer resources left available for you to complete other cognitive processes like thinking or memory. And that might affect how well we can perform our usual hearing and memory tasks. And that might be why there's a relationship between hearing loss and poorer cognitive function. Another one of these hypotheses is that it's called the reduced sensory input hypothesis. And that's kind of the stuff I was saying before about the ear is less effective in converting that sound information to information that your brains can read and understand. And that means less stimulation is happening. So the hearing brain area gets less stimulation, and then in turn, the other brain areas also get less stimulation, which could lead to disuse and atrophy in those areas as well, which could affect their processing, so their cognitive functioning. And researchers tell us that the other factors might influence this relationship. So social isolation or reduced interaction. If you have hearing loss and you feel like you can't really cope with these kind of social dynamic environments when there's a lot of speakers and a lot of noise, might lead you to kind of withdraw from those. And there's ageism and stigma involved around wearing hearing aids, and also depression plays a role as well. And all of these are kind of risk factors for poor cognitive functioning as well. So I thought I'd just briefly mention the kind of work that we do. So a lot of our work is involved in understanding how the brain works after hearing loss. And I thought I'd just give you a couple of the questions that we have projects on that we're trying to look at now. And then there's a link to our website. So if you want to learn more about any of these projects, you can go there and read about them in more detail. So one of the things we're looking at is how the brain's resources are used during listening tasks. We're also looking at the links between hearing loss and cognitive function, and how that relationship might have been affected by enforced isolation that we all experienced during COVID-19 lockdowns. We're also interested in health inequality factors that are associated with hearing loss. So what lifestyle or inequality factors lead to increased risk of hearing loss? And just end on a positive note of what we can do to keep our brains nice and healthy and nice and active. Although I said that hearing loss is a modifiable risk factor for dementia, this actually means that it can be changed. And it's not a given. I should say that if you have hearing loss in later life, it doesn't mean that you're going to get dementia. It just increases risk factor. So one thing we can do to keep our brains healthy is to go and check our hearing, see our GP, audiologist. If we think we might need hearing aids, if we're asking people to repeat themselves or turn the TV up, or if you already have hearing aids but you don't feel like they're working for you, you can go back and let them know, and maybe they can adjust your settings to make them work better. And there's even some online hearing tests that you can do for free on the Specsavers website. I think there's one on the World Health Organization website as well, to check to see if your hearing is, super human or not so good. And also, social interaction is a protective factor against dementia. So upkeeping our interactions, chatting with our friends, is actually really good to keep our brains active and healthy. So you can tell your bosses that at work, that you need to have lots of breaks to interact with people. And that's everything. So thank you really very much for listening. And I hope you found it interesting to learn a bit about hearing loss and the brain.